Welcome back to another episode of A Gift from Adversity. My name is Juri Love. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today we are recording episode 74. Today's guest, Adrian Jones, came to our show for episode 69, but he generously came back and he's willing to share another adversity that he went through. Before I introduce him, I want to introduce my book, which is A Gift from Adversity, which is available on Amazon. And A Gift from Adversity subtitle is Overcoming Sexual Abuse, Domestic Violence, Bullying, and Homelessness. And if you go on Amazon, you can find A Gift from Adversity by Juri Love. So please check it out. After I published my book, I have gotten a lot of messages from people from all over the places that they are also a victim of child sex abuse or domestic violence, bullying, and homelessness. And I felt compelled to create a platform where people can talk solely about adversity, but not only that, tools that they all use to overcome, and a gift that came from it. And before I introduced tonight's guest, I want to shout out to my friend Lovan Gordon and Love Life Now Foundation. Lovan came to our show, but last Friday I got to model for a fashion show fundraiser they held, and I got to meet the victims of domestic violence, and I got to walk the runway, and it was very empowering. So I just wanted to mention lovelifenow.org. And if you are going through any domestic violence situation, please check out the website and reach out to them. Help is there. So let's introduce our guest for tonight's podcast. Hi, Adrian.
Hi, Juri. Hello.
Great to see you again.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me back on the show.
Absolutely. So, Adrian, before we move on to our first question, can you introduce yourself to our audience, including your name, where you're coming in, and your website, social media, and what you do?
Absolutely. And thank you for that opportunity. So, again, it's Adrian Jones. I'm joining this conversation from Northern California, just north of San Francisco in Marin County. I have a couple of social media platforms, if you will, that people can connect with me on. One is my website, adrianjones.me. And then I also have a Twitter handle with basically the same thing, Adrian Jones _me. And finally, I do have a podcast myself called Profound Awesomeness. That's also out there as well. If people want to get to know me a little bit better, there are some ways to reach out and get in touch and get to know my story, my message a little bit more.
Great. So, adrianjones.me is the website.
That's right.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much, Adrian. And I am so honored to have you back on my podcast tonight. I really enjoyed listening to your story on episode 69, which you talked about your heart attack story and then the adversity that you went through. But today, we are talking about different adversity that you went through along kind of the way of your heart attack journey. So would you please tell us the adversity that you went through? So let's focus on the adoption topic that you mentioned.
Yeah. So there you go. I'm adopted. And I found out at a very young age when I was, well, my parents and I have a nice, fun debate about when I found out, but we don't really have an agreement when exactly I was told, but before I had an age of consciousness, I think is when they told me. And so I grew up knowing that I was adopted. My younger sister, from roughly 2 years younger than I am, is also adopted. My parents were naturally unable to have children, and so they raised and grew a family through adoption. It's just the two of us as children in my particular family. We grew up in Colorado, just outside Denver, Colorado, in a town called Littleton, where we grew up on what I like to call a magical little petting zoo with horses and chickens and ducks and dogs and cats and guinea pigs and uh, you name it. And it was in many ways a very idyllic upbringing. But it goes without saying that when you're adopted, it comes with other territories that, we all have things that we deal with and things that we maybe are challenged by, or if we find adverse. Um, Being raised as an adoptee, I mean, I felt all the love in the world from my family. I think it was hard at times to reconcile, well, how do I really fit into the family, as we talk about, as my parents would talk about the lineage and the history of their ancestors. Does that, I always wonder, does that carry on through me as I'm a adopted member of the family, or do I automatically assume that they are?
You got muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Unmute myself. There we are. I don't know how that happened. That automatically clicked on. I apologize to your audience that for that. Uh, but yeah, so basically, I think where I left off, or before I got muted, was just sort of connecting in with the family and understanding my connections to the family lore and the legacy of the ancestors that came before us in the family. And that was some challenging, adverse moments for me growing up and trying to understand how I fit in that way.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And let's talk about your adoptive parents. Like, do they look like you? Are they like similar looking or completely different looking?
Well, growing up, it always cracked me up that when people would say I look like my parents. I mean, I guess you could say there are some ways that we do look together. I think there was some genetic mirroring, if you will, that took place. But I think if you saw the family profile, you would say absolutely. I don't see a real common connection between physically how we look, and especially with my younger sister. Uh, what you can't tell here is I sit on the screen. Well, I used to have dark hair. It's turning a bit of a grayer shade these days. But I'm about 6 foot 2 feet tall, with darker features and dark hair, whereas my sister is about 5 foot 2, very fair in features and with blonde hair. And so physically we're very different. And so for us growing up, I mean, we were brother and sister and have a very, very strong bond, always have had a very strong bond. But when we go out and introduce ourselves as brother and sister, if people don't know we're adopted, they might look at us a little funny. And there were a couple of times, Juri, believe it or not, when we would go out, when we were old enough to go out to dinner and to bars by ourselves and being of drinking age and stuff like that, where we would go to a restaurant and my sister would go to the bathroom and the waiter would or waitress would come up and say, "Would your date like something to drink?" It was like, no, 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 that's my sister. But anyways, that just happened a couple of times. It was always awkward and made me squeam as they said that. But I guess it's understandable. If you saw us together, you wouldn't see a physical resemblance whatsoever.
So, did you find out? You said at young age. Do you remember how old you were?
Well, see, this is where my parents and I have this running debate, and I don't know if it will ever be solved because we don't have any eyewitnesses. But we have, I claim that I found out when I was in fourth or fifth grade. That's when, and my parents will say that's when I actually understood what they were telling me, that I was adopted. But regardless, when they did in fourth that moment, and maybe it was fifth grade, come to think about it, Juri, but when they told me, I thought it was really cool. I thought it made me stand out and gave me a point of differentiation from all the other kids who may not have been adopted. It gave me an opportunity to go to school and run around and tell my friends, hey, I'm adopted. I didn't fully comprehend everything that it meant, but it was an interesting point of differentiation for me that I held with a great amount of pride, believe it or not, that I was adopted, and it helped me have my own identity in a time when that was really important before we got into middle school and the teenage years and stuff like that. It gave me a unique, and maybe other adoptees would think that that was a very strange response, but for me it was something that I felt very strongly about and carried with me with a great deal of pride.
Were you ever experience? Did you ever experience bullying because you were adopted?
Yes. Yeah. Not very often, but definitely it did happen where people would chide me or mention, well, they're not your parents aren't your real parents. Um, that would happen, but I just would ignore it, and I knew where I came from, and my parents were the parents that raised me. My adoptive parents were and are my parents, and always have been my parents. But yeah, there was some bullying, but luckily I was tall relative to the rest of my peer group, so no one gave me too hard a time in those early years. Yeah.
So after you found out, like, did you have identity crisis? You said that you felt kind of cool, but like, was there a time maybe later on, maybe teenage year, high school, adulthood? Is there any part of you that kind of started to wonder um, who your parents are, or maybe identity crisis or self doubt?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was born where I live now in Marin County, California, but when I was 4, my dad accepted a job in the Denver area, and so that's when we moved to Littleton, Colorado, and I lived there when I was 4 years old to when I was a senior in high school. And then I was in high school in Massachusetts, and then went to college in Southern California and graduate school in Southern California. And as I grew up and got older, as was a young adult, I lived in Belgium, I lived in Hong Kong, I lived in San Francisco. Eventually, got married, had children, and moved into the suburbs out of San Francisco, and moved to Marin County back in 2006. So a little over 16 years ago. And it was then that I started to wonder. I knew I was born here. I obviously knew I was adopted. And then I began to wonder, am I standing in line in the grocery store behind a blood relative of mine? Is that my mother, my biological mother? Is that my biological father? Is this a cousin, a first cousin, a second cousin, a third cousin that I'm interacting with? When I went to back to school night for our kids back in elementary school, when they were in elementary school, I would wonder, am I sitting next to my brothers and sisters? Are they here on this campus too? Because it's conceivable that they were about my same age, who might have children about the same age of my children. I started to coach youth soccer. I loved coaching youth soccer and did that for a long time in our community. And I would wonder if I was coaching a niece or a nephew um, on my soccer teams. So that's when I really started to, at that stage, and at that point, I'm a married man. I'm a father of young children, and that's when I really started to start to have, I don't know if this is the exact word, this wonderment about where I came from, and am I surrounded? I'm at my roots where I was born. Do my roots connect me to other biological roots within my community? And that's when it started to happen for me.
But prior to that, then when you're living in Hong Kong or Belgium or Massachusetts, you didn't that didn't occur to you.
Didn't know. I had other things that I was thinking about in those days. I was trying to start my life and travel the world and find my fortune and figure out my legacy and do all those things you do when you're in your late teens and in your 20s. It really didn't hit me, and I was very and have been very comfortable with the identity within my adoptive family. That these were my parents, and I never had it hits adoptees at various stages in their lives when they choose to search or begin to ask questions. I mean, it can happen at young ages and the teenager and all this stuff. Like I say, for me, it didn't really start to happen until I was well into my 30s, that I started to have those questions. Um, so that was, my journey. But like I say, for adoptees, they would have, and I believe you've had another guest a few episodes ago who talked about his particular journey. Like, it's all of our adoptee journeys are very unique, and we arrive at times of questioning at different stages of our growth and development.
I really appreciate you sharing the story of being adoptee and then adaptation. Just to let you know, I'm from Japan and I never grew up where the culture really accept adoption much, um, because of bloodlines and history of Japan. So, for instance, if you are doctor's son, you're gonna be doctor. If you are politician son, you're gonna be politician. But not only that, like say the last name has kanji, which is a Chinese character, and then people judge you sometimes with the Chinese character that they inherit. So for instance, my mom's side, my dad's side is different. My dad's side used most like a farming side of the Chinese character, where my mom's side uses more samurai side of the character. So when you see the trait, we had a caste system that we kind of had discrimination within us. So the bloodline, keeping it like in a family is like really, really important to our culture. Where in America, I hear a lot of story about adoption, and I hear a lot of people. It's not too rare, and then I think the culture is very different in America. So, what do you think? Like when you are in Hong Kong, for instance, or Belgium, have you thought about those things, or it didn't really occur to you as adoptee, or maybe had any limitation of your ability or thinking way?
No, it really didn't. It didn't bring inhibitions or limitations into my life. I was determined that I was going to go live my life a certain way, and I had the love and support of my parents, the adopted ones. And I'll tell you what, though, Juri, along the lines of what you're saying about the Japanese culture, it triggered a thought and a memory that I had that my parents shared with me not that long ago. My mother had an aunt now my mother's from England, and so her aunt was English, and in her will she left a little bit of inheritance money to her various cousins or in her family, and those children were the age group of myself and my younger sister. And because we weren't blood relatives to her, we did not participate in any inheritance from her because we weren't blood. And uh, when my parents told me this, I was probably mid to late 40s, and I was shocked. And at the same time, not even the least bit surprised that you hear about these things happening. Um, and it was the first time that I had heard about that level of, call it discrimination, within my own adoptive family lines, where I experienced that. My sister experienced that, not directly. We were never told this would have happened when we were children, or probably pre-teenage years. But that was kept secret from us all the way until 7 or 8, 6, 7 years ago.
Wow. Do you think it's a British kind of culture than American, maybe.
Maybe, maybe, yeah. I mean, this goes back. This would have been in the 70s. Times were different then. I can't attribute that behavior to either that particular person or the culture in which she was raised and living at the time. It's really hard for me to discern the difference between the two. But I think it probably happened here in the States as well. Similar situations that children were considered not blood and therefore not part of the family and not deserving of inheriting family things, which is such a disappointment.
It is. It's very shocking, and especially when you consider obviously your adopted mom and dad, your parents, and when they don't have discrimination against you and then welcomed you as their children, however, biologically it's not related, but then the relatives or, you know, whoever friends, close friends, start to discriminate like that, that must be truly heartbreaking.
Truly heartbreaking. It was really hard to hear, even though I this wasn't that long ago, and I wasn't super young and wasn't dealing with a lot of hormones and emotions or whatever of my being a teenager, rambunctious teenager. It was hard to hear, and I had a fair amount of disbelief that that actually happened in the family, that we weren't seen as family and raised as considered like everybody else in the broader family, that there was that level of bias and discrimination. And I don't know how pervasive it is. I don't know where it stops and starts. And that's a hard part. I mean, maybe, that's something to think about and for me to take away and explore in terms of my own family. Where does it does exist? We have it. We have evidence that it existed. Um, where else does it exist? If it exists here, it probably exists somewhere else. But then again, in all fairness, this was back probably in the late 70s, and times have changed considerably here in 2022. So, I don't know, Juri, but it's something that I'd like to think more about.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And
Yeah.
then in your last episode with us, on episode 69, you mentioned about the heart attack, and then that kind of led to really search for your birth parents. So, can you please tell our audience about that?
Yeah. And quite a story it is. Quite a story it is. For those who haven't heard episode 69, I had a heart attack in 2016, mountain biking with some friends of mine here in my local community. And after I came through surgery, I had a stent procedure in my left anterior descending artery known as the widowmaker. I was, once the surgery was completed and I was deemed fit for the ICU, the recovery unit, I was wheeled into my hospital room and I had the room all to myself, which was very nice. And the nurses hooked me up to all the machines and had leads on my chest and IVs in my arms and oxygen meters on the ends of my fingers. And once they saw that I was stable and in good condition to be left alone, the nurses left me to my thoughts. And the first thought that I had, and Juri, I cannot prove this, but I can tell you what I experienced, was that I had a voice speak to me in my right ear that said, "Find your birth parents." It was very clear, it was very distinct, and I knew in that moment that that's what I needed to do, was to go find my biological family. I concluded that I just survived this very serious heart attack. I mean, many people don't survive what I went through. And I concluded that now's the time to go search. I almost checked out of here, and my biological family might have wanted to know how I turned out. Maybe they wanted to know, did I have a family and had a happy life and a happy upbringing? Do I have siblings that might know about me and want to be reunited with their brother? And then I finally also wanted to know, does heart disease run in in my genes? And that was hugely important to me as well. So after I left the hospital, I was bound and determined to go find my biological family for the first time at age 47 years old. This is the time, whereas we were talking earlier where I wasn't so, it never really dawned on me to go find my biological family. I mean, I might have thought of it a handful of times growing up and through my teenage and early 20s, but it was a very passing thought. Now it was loud and clear that this is what I wanted to do. And so, but I didn't know where to begin. I left the hospital in my recovery of my heart attack, and I didn't know where to start. Do I Google how to find your biological family? I was a little unaware of the power of these commercial DNA companies like Ancestry and 23andMe. I hadn't really thought about using those as ways to find my biological family. And it wasn't till I went to my first social event 6 weeks after my heart attack. I was out at a fundraiser for our community, and a woman came up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, Adrian, I heard about your heart attack." And she said, "Is it genetic?" And I said, "I have no idea. I'm adopted." And she said, "Have you ever thought about finding your biological family?" And I said, "Well, yeah, now I really want to find them." And she said, "Well, where were you born?" And I said, "Well, right down the road here at Marin General Hospital." And she said, "Well, what was your birthday?" And I was beginning to wonder, why was this woman asking me these really intense questions at this social event? And I gave her my birthday, and that was the end of the conversation. It was broken up by other people coming in and sort of joining our conversation. That was the end of that. Well, she comes up to me later in the party and holds her phone up to my face, and it has a table, and she tells me that this might contain information about my biological family. And I said, I can't process this. I'm having too much fun. Can you email me this tomorrow? So she emails me this document the next day, and in it, it lists all the children born in Marin County on my birthday back in 1969. There are 5 births. 4 of the 5 births have names like John Doe, Jane Doe, or whatever. I mean, just traditional names, like Adrian Jones or Juri Love or whatever. But there was one instance of the 5 babies that were born that didn't have a conventional name. It just listed the last name of the biological mother and the last name of the biological father. And this friend of mine said to me, "This is how California records unwed births. Perhaps these are the last names of your biological family. Do you want to know more?" She wrote in her email to me. And I replied back immediately, "Absolutely. My head is splitting. I want to know more." So 2 days after that particular event, we went for a walk, and she proceeds to tell me she's a genetic genealogist. So she goes out and helps people find their genetic roots and their past. And she works a lot with adoptees who are seeking their biological families. I couldn't believe the stroke of luck that I had somebody like this, who I will later find out is incredibly talented at her craft, land in my lap and offered her services to help me find my biological family. I couldn't believe it, Juri. And so we went for a walk, and I told her everything I knew about my biological family, or parents, rather. All I knew at that time is that my biological mother was Norwegian, or of Norwegian descent, had brothers, and was Catholic. And my friend, her name is Christina. Christina said, "Okay, that's great. That's actually a lot of information." And then she said, "What do you know about your biological father?" And I gave her what little information I knew about him. So we continued our walk. At the end of our walk, she had an ancestry DNA kit in her car, which I guess genetic genealogists are wont to do, is to have these kits readily available for immediate use. And I spit in the vial, and she drove off with my DNA as she was going to send to Ancestry. And I drove home from that meeting thinking, "Oh my gosh, what have I done? I've given personal information to this woman that I just met, and she now has control of my DNA and my sequencing. What have I done?" But I concluded that things are happening for a reason. I met her for a reason, and I needed to trust the greater universe that's working, that brought us together. So 2 days after that, so this would be a Thursday, in late November 2016, she sends me a text and she says, "Where are you? I need to show you something." And I was walking my dog relatively near her house. And so I said, I'll be by your house in 20 minutes. And 20 minutes later, I show up at her place and she lets me in. We sit down at the kitchen table. And she said, I've been doing some research. And I said, okay. She said, I've been looking at the last name of what might be the biological mother of that child born to unwed parents. The last name was Kyle, Kyle. And that's an unusual last name. And so I started looking at all the registries and phone books of the various counties that comprise the San Francisco Bay Area, Marin County, Alameda County, San Francisco County, looking for women of childbearing age with the last name Kyle. And she found 2. But one had given birth in September 1969. I'm an October 1969 baby. And so that woman was ruled out. That left one other woman who had child-rearing age in 1969 with the last name Kyle. And my friend Christina, my new friend at this point, Christina said to me, can you guess where she lived at the time you were born? And I said, I have no idea. I have no idea. And she said, just take a guess. I said, Christina, I really have no idea. I'm not going to guess. And she said, well, she lived in Marin County, which is where we moved to in 2006. And I said, okay, I guess I'm not surprised by that. So why is that important? And she goes, guess what town she lived in when she, in 1969? I said, I have no idea. And she said, San Anselmo, California, which is the town that I randomly moved to in 2006 with my wife and 2 children and a dog. And it turns out, and so I was born in October 69, and Christina did some more research that she shared with me, and she found out through Ancestry, building her family tree in Ancestry, that she had Norwegian relatives, and she had 2 brothers. So this started to check out what I knew about her. And then Christina said to me, this person was 24 in 1969. I took her back to when she would have been 18 to see when if she would have graduated from some of the local high schools in the area, because public yearbooks are public record and available for the public. So she did that. She rolled back this woman's age from 24 and 69 down to like the early 60s and started looking for a woman with the last name Kyle who would have gone to the local high schools, the public high schools. And she didn't find any instance of this particular person. Her name is Sharon Kyle. Lo and behold, Christina says to me, but guess what? And I said, what? She goes, can you guess where this person went to a high school? And I thought, oh no, don't you dare tell me what I think you're going to tell me. Don't you dare tell me. And she said, you better believe it. And I said, this is crazy. And I start losing my mind and I'm viscerally coming apart at the seams. And my emotions went from 0 to 60 so fast. I'm terrified. I'm bracing myself at the table for what she's about to tell me. And she said that this woman, Sharon Kyle, graduated from Marin Catholic High School in 1962. And that's hugely significant because my daughter was a freshman at Marin Catholic High School and was 2 months into her freshman year at the same high school that this woman attended many, many years earlier. And then Christina said, so you freaking out yet? I said, yeah, I'm kind of freaking out, but we don't know that this woman is my mother. And she goes, well, let me just show you something. So I stand up and look over her shoulder onto the screen of her laptop. And she shows me a picture of a girl who's a sophomore in high school. And instantly, I knew I was looking at the face of my biological mother. It exploded out of me. I jumped up and screamed, that's her. And I knew I was looking at the face. I was seeing my face in the picture of this black and white photograph of a sophomore girl in high school. I knew that was her. I knew from her eyes, her nose, her cheekbone structure, this was my biological mother. And then I started to freak out. I started to lose, like, so much visceral emotions exploded from within. It was crazy. Tears are flowing out of my eyes. I've got goosebumps rippling up and down my body. This woman, Christina, in a period of 5 days, 4 or 5 days, in my mind, went from meeting me, and I didn't really know her when we met at that party, to what I was convinced was my biological mother. We didn't have DNA to prove the smoking gun, but I was absolutely convinced I didn't need DNA. That was her. And so we went on a journey from there, waiting for DNA to come in. And eventually it did it in December of that year, and proved that that woman was indeed my biological mother.
Wow. Speechless.
Speechless. I mean, there's a lot more to the story, but just hitting pause for a moment and thinking about the coincidences and circumstances, and are there such things? But it blows my mind, and here it's almost 6 years since we've been through this process, and it still blows my mind that in 2006 I moved to this small town north of San Francisco because we could afford a house and we liked the community and the schools. Fast forward to working with Christina and looking for my biological mother, to find out that she lived, when she carried me in her belly, she lived in the same little town and drove by my house every day to and from her high school, Marin Catholic High School, where it's a private Catholic high school. It's the same school my daughter was already a freshman at. My daughter was walking under the school has the senior year portraits of all the classes in their administration halls. And my daughter was unwittingly walking under the picture of her maternal grandmother for 2 to 2.5 months before we had this discovery, which just, like, I don't get how the world works in that way to make that happen, but it did. And it's just extraordinary in my mind.
Wow. So were you able to meet her at some point?
Oh, yes. Yes. In end of January of 2017, we also found my biological father. They live so I'm in Northern California, as I've said before. My biological mother lives in the East Bay, and my biological father lives in the wine country north of us in Sonoma. We found him as well. And in late January 2017, I put letters in the mail to each of them, same day delivery through FedEx, and surrendered myself to fate. And I wrote a 3-page letter. It's like, my name's Adrian Jones. This is where I'm coming from. I come from a good place. I have had a heart attack. I'm trying to get answers to my genetic risks, but I also have a huge heart, and I would love to share it with you if you're open to it, and things like that. And I included my contact information, and here's my email address and my mobile phone number. And 5 days later, I got an email from Sharon, and the subject line said, "Thank you." And in it, she had indicated that she never changed. She said it was very emotional getting my letter. And she indicated that she never changed her last name in the hopes that I would come find her. And she proceeded to tell me about her daughter, who's my half sister, and her husband and their young children, who Christine and I already had sleuthed out and found out about them through the powers of ancestry and online searching, and using tools like Facebook, which is really good for doing genetic searches when you have some little hints of information you can use. And we met a few days after that, and that was the first time we met. And we met in a hotel lobby for 6 hours. I brought with me my adoption papers and a photograph book that my mom gave me at my wedding, of all pictures that she loved of me growing up through life, from the day I was welcomed home into the family post-adoption, all the way up through my graduation from graduate school to my wedding. So it was like a wedding present to me sort of capturing these moments that she thought was really special. So I thought that was a really good photograph book to bring to meet my biological mother, and go through those photos one by one, sitting in a hotel lobby, extraordinarily emotional, extraordinarily emotional. In fact, I should tell you, I got to the hotel before Sharon did, Sharon being my biological mother, of course. And I'm exploring the hotel lobby, trying to find a nice place for us to sit. And Sharon sends me a text, and right, and I'm all the way in the back end of the lobby, and she sends me a text and says, "I'm here at the front." And my heart leapt, just totally leapt, and my feet didn't hit the ground the whole way I started to walk back to the front of the lobby to greet her. And we were at this place called the Claremont Hotel, and the lobby has a lot of glass in the front door, so there was a lot of light streaming through, and all I saw was a silhouette of this woman walking towards me, and I couldn't really make out her face or features until she was probably 6 or 7 feet away from me, and we locked eyes. I mean, we completely connected. I dropped this backpack that had the photographs in it and my adoption papers. That was immaterial to me, and we embraced in this massive hug. And it's like no other feeling I've ever had in my life. I've tried to write about it. I've tried to blog about it. I try to talk about it with people. It's impossible to put into words what that connection and that moment was when we first laid eyes on each other. We first saw each other. We had that first embrace. And this goes back to early February 2017. And we have since seen each other tons of times. We text all the time. We're very close. I should tell you, so on my maternal side, I've got Sharon, and then I've got her daughter, my sister, and her family. And then on the paternal side, I've got Ron, who's my biological father, and I have two sisters or two half sisters on that side. I like to round up and just call them sisters, not half sisters. That's just me, though. And they all live within an hour drive of my house. And I'm very connected with all of them. I've been sort of the trilogy here: acknowledged, welcomed, and embraced into the family. Critical things as an adoptee, reaching back out into the biological family, to be so important to be acknowledged, so important to be welcomed, but then to truly be embraced is so key. It has been for me, and I hope that if anyone's listening to this and they're a biological family and who has had a unusual surprise of a biological relative who's shown up in their life, that they acknowledge that person, because it's a very, very tender and vulnerable thing to be an adoptee reaching back into your biological family, because you have no idea how that is going to be received whatsoever. And to at least be acknowledged, at a bare minimum, I acknowledge you, is huge. But to take it even further, it just gets even huger and more powerful. And to put a bow on it, Juri, and I'll stop rambling here, but I hate to use the term, but it's like a Hallmark movie. It's just been a remarkable reunion. I am so fortunate and so blessed to have these people in my life, and to now be, we're well past the honeymoon phase. Now it's like life, and we just call each other and we chat, and we're not on eggshells around each other. We're just family, and it's really great. And there's a lot more love in my life and in my family's life because of it.
And then, how are your adopted parents taking the fact that you found the biological parents?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's changed over time. My parents, adoptive, live on the East Coast outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And when all this was going down, it was really hard, especially hard on my mother, because everything was here in the San Francisco area, and I was establishing these biological connections, having these meetings, and they were going so well. I was on cloud 9 when all this was happening. I was just the happiest person in the world as I was meeting them, and they were acknowledging, welcoming, and embracing me into their families. But in the early days, I'm not going to lie, it was really tough on my parents and especially my mother. Fast forward 4 years, I was able to introduce my dad to my biological father, Ron. We were able to have a meeting and sit down and have a cup of coffee together, which was really great. It was great for me to have a full circle moment to bring these two men together. My mother, unfortunately, has not been able to be out here to meet either of Ron or Sharon, my biological parents. But both of them have come around. And in fact, my mother said to me on the phone the other day, in fact, since we last did our episode together, episode 69, she said to me, "Tell Ron and Sharon hi, tell them they're like family to us," which I almost fell off my chair, considering where she was 4 or 5 years earlier, where I didn't talk about any of this with my adopted parents for years because I knew how sensitive and tender they were about the whole topic.
I just can't put my head around about all the emotions, all the tenderness and sensitivities, and there's a joy, but at the same time there's a sensitivity of almost territorial um things that, or physically, that you across the country as well, but then maybe insecurity and all that stuff, but the joy, it's just I really appreciate you sharing this story. And did your mom or dad tell you why they put you to adoption?
Yes. Oh, yes. So when I had in fact, so yes, so I want to tell you a couple of things. So when I got that email from Sharon with the subject line that said "thank you" in it, we went back and forth on email that night and agreed to talk the next day. And so I called her at the phone number she gave me. And I have to tell you, hearing her voice for the first time, it rang 3 times, and I thought it was going to go straight to voicemail. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to say in this voicemail? Does her husband know I exist? Does anyone know I exist? Do I leave a message? Do I not? I don't know. But she did answer, and she said, "Hello, Adrian." And it was just so amazing to hear her voice. But, anyways, we had a wonderful talk for 2 hours. It went all over the place, very, very emotional. And she told me that she and Ron had dated. They were in their mid 20s. They weren't like high school sweethearts or in their teens when this happened. They were in their mid 20s, as I alluded to earlier. That Sharon was 24 when she had me as a baby, and Ron was in his later 20s at the time. So they were, older and adults, and they had gotten engaged. And along I came, and my arrival in Sharon's world, if you will, prompted her to have an awakening. And she realized that she did not want to marry the man who had proposed to her. So she decided to terminate the engagement and put me up for adoption because she was at the time, and this was in 1969, these were very different times, but that would have made her a single mother, which was, I was a baby at the time, but as I look back and listen to history, it was frowned upon, was not greatly welcomed. And not only that, she was a first year elementary school teacher, hardly making barely enough money to pay the rent. So she didn't have the means and the wherewithal to raise me. And so she concluded that the best thing for me was to put me up for adoption into a loving family who had the means to give me the childhood and the upbringing that she could not provide. And so that was her rationale. And she and I have talked about this at length. And I'm very at peace with her rationale, and I do not harbor her any sort of ill will or anything. But those were the difficult decisions that she had to make at the time with my best interests at heart.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that.
Of
So,
course.
Adrian, I want to shift our question, but before we move on to the tools part, I just want to really thank you for sharing your story. Like Damon Davis has the wonderful podcast called "Who Am I Really?" and then he shared his story of being adoptee, and now you're my second guest talking about this. And
Sure.
I've had friends who were adopted, and I think there are not so much platforms for people to connect and then share their story. And then I call it adversity because, such as, the one that earlier you mentioned about discrimination within the family or maybe bullying, but you said maybe your appearance helped to not get bullied really bad, but maybe some kids out there that I know of that they are getting bullied in like even 2022 right now. And I think as an adult that your story who survived through this mental stage of wondered that who am I, and trying to find out the birth parents and then the heart attack that you went through. And I think it's significantly important that we share these stories. So I just can't thank you enough for being so vulnerable and being honest, just like other time. But this was very significant story, and you're such a great storyteller. So thank you so much for doing that.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
So let's talk about tools that you use to overcome all these challenges that you went through as adoptee. What are the tools that you can share with our audience that really helped you?
Yeah, and I'll answer it this way. The tools really became helpful for me when I decided to search for my biological family. Now, I I hope that there are now adoption competent therapists who are able to work with families and children who are adoptees. One thing, and I'll get to my tools, but I'll just do a plug here. One thing that a lot of people do not realize is that separation of the child from the biological mother is traumatic. It creates a PTSD, and it's precognition in a way that you have this PTSD because as a child in utero, you've spent 9 months preparing to meet the person that's creating you. You know her smell or the scent. I mean, this is as a child. This is they've done tons of studies now on this, and it creates this post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome, which is really tricky for children that are adoptees. So my public service announcement is I hope that adoptive parents are providing adoption competent therapists and therapy for their children, because we didn't have that growing up. And there is a reason, and I don't, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, that, adoptees are, what is it, 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than the average population. And we're overrepresented in addiction treatment settings. And it makes you wonder, why is that? Well, now they're doing the studies and they realize that there is this issue that needs to be addressed. And so there's a wonderful book called The Primal Wound by Nancy Verrier, Verrier. I believe I spelt that properly, which is a really powerful book. And in reading that at my ripe old age, or very recently, opened my eyes to situations and behaviors I experienced and felt as a child growing up. So I just want to do a public service announcement there, but I will tell you the tools that were really helpful for me once I started to strike out and find my biological family. One was reading The Primal Wound, and fully understanding that, and highlighting it and writing in the margins and all this sort of stuff. It was also helpful to listen to there are a slew of podcasts that are out there around adoptees, and those were really helpful to hear. And I know Damon has an incredibly great podcast called "Who Am I Really?" about adoptees in reunion, and that he does a terrific job shining a light on those stories and those journeys. So that was helpful. I created what I call the adoptee supergroup, which is the supergroup is just something fun we call ourselves, but it's a collection of adoptees, or about 6 or 7 of us that get together periodically. We haven't since COVID. We've not gotten together since then, unfortunately, and I need to pull us back together. But really helpful to get together with other adoptees and share our stories. Some of these adoptees are in reunion like me. Others are not ready to be in reunion and may never be in reunion. And that's their journey and their decision. But it was really powerful for us to bond together and share a common language and a common, I guess, bond, for lack of a better way to say it. So those would be some definite tools that have been helpful. And then, frankly, if people go to adrianjones.me, I've got to update my website a little bit, but I have some blogs on there, and it was really helpful for me to write these issues down, coming, as they say, there's an expression, coming out of the fog, coming out of this adoptee and really understanding the challenges that adoptees have at a much later period in our life. And journaling those and putting them into blog format was really helpful, to just get it off and to put it out there to the world to see how people would respond, and hopefully create awareness to some of the challenges and thoughts that adoptees have. So those were, and those were later in life tools that I've used in the last 5 years.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for saying that. And then just to really resonate with you, and interestingly about the 9 months like in the womb, and then smell and the bonding that you experience before you are born, and you're willing to meet this person that basically raised you inside of her body, and then get separated from that. I didn't realize that itself creates the PTSD, and I didn't realize that a lot of adoptees, like suicidal rate and addiction rate is higher. I had no idea. But then I can also imagine not only identity crisis or wondered why I was adopted in adoptee situations, but the discrimination that they go through or bullying that they go through, I think it must be the contribution to that also, especially when your adopted parents look very different from you. There may be a amount of teasing and then all that stuff too. But yes.
Yeah, and I would say another public service announcement while I have this microphone on your podcast is, adoptees, we are discriminated against. And there are laws, believe it or not, it's 2022, and there are laws in our country by state, not every state, but a majority of states, that prohibit adoptees from obtaining their original birth certificate, or their OBC, as we refer to them. So let's hypothetically say, I was born in California. Let's pretend you were born in California. If you went to the Office of Vital Records and wanted your original birth certificate, I don't know what the experience would be, but I think it would be something like, Juri, no problem, fill out this form, we'll mail it to you. Whereas I, as an adoptee, I cannot get that information. I cannot get my original birth certificate. That is a state law that I cannot have it. And so, and it's not just California. There are other states that are like that. And these laws were put in place decades and decades ago to protect the child, to protect the anonymity of the child, of the adoptee, to protect the anonymity of the biological or birth mother. But it is, if we're a nation of equality and equal rights under the law, then there's something that's amiss here. And I hope that, there's a lot of really great people who are working on this at the state level, who are adoptees, who are trying to get legislature overturned so that we can just merely have the very simple request met that we would like our original birth certificates. And it's crazy that states still are dug into holding on to these laws because, by the way, commercial DNA companies like Ancestry and 23andMe make it easy for me to go find out who my biological family is. I don't need to go get my original birth certificate to find out my biological mother's name and then go track her down with a private investigator or something. I can go find that information by just spitting into a vial and sending it off and hearing back in a few weeks and hopefully getting connected to relatives. So there is a level still to this day of discrimination, which I'd like to shine a light on while I have this opportunity.
That is very crazy to me. I've never heard of this. And then I just hope that the state uh, lawmakers will take it serious. And then I'm sure there's pros and cons, but I don't know where the cons are. Like, say, if you shine a light on what happened to you about the heart attack, for instance, so generic disease, when you are going to physical exam, like doctor ask that,
Right.
what's your family history, and you have to fill out blank.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
you think that it can contribute maybe a prevention of some sort of like yourself heart attack or like anything that maybe you could have done a little bit differently had you had access to this.
Right. I mean, it just in my own unique situation. So back in the hospital, when I had that voice talk to me in my ear and say, "Find your biological family," or "Find your birth parents," exact were the exact words. One of the things that came to mind was I need to find out my genetic past. Well, it turns out that heart disease runs in the maternal line of my biological family. It's like a serial killer. So that would have been really helpful information for me to have had. I don't know, 20, 25 years ago. I might have made very different lifestyle and consumption decisions, knowing that I had this ticking time bomb in my genes. But I wasn't given that privilege of knowledge. And so, like so many adoptees from my era who haven't found their biological families, we're flying blind as it relates to your exact point about going to the doctors and they ask you, "Does any of this run in the family?" We leave it blank, or we write NA, adopted, not applicable, adopted, and we've just had to live with that.
Well, I hope that someday it would change, and then someday we have enough petition, and then not only just adoptees, but friends and families or people who are listening to, maybe some shift can happen to protect our health and the future generation to come, because that's not only affecting you, but your children and your grandchildren as
That's
well.
right. That's right. That's exactly right. Yep, you're spot on.
Well, thank you. So, last question I have is a gift that came from this adversity. So, how would you describe the gift that came from this adversity?
Well, the first, maybe an obvious gift, is I found out about my genetic risks in my DNA, and it shouldn't even be a gift, but it was a gift to know that. But the bigger and most profoundly powerful gift for me was meeting my biological family, both parents and my three sisters, and throw in a few cousins here and there, but I'll focus on the nuclear family of my parents and my three sisters. Having them in my lives has changed everything. They I didn't realize this, Juri. I met my in March of 2017. I met Ron, my biological father, and his two daughters, my two sisters, uh, at a restaurant here locally. And the night after we met, it was a wonderful get together. We all had I thought it was just magical. And the night after, yeah, the night after we got together, I called the sisters to make sure they were doing okay, because they didn't know I existed until I reached out to their father. So they had a big surprise that, oh, they have a big brother in their lives. So I called them both, and the youngest one said to me that she was up all night crying after we had met. And I asked her, "Why were you crying?" And she said, "I've always wanted a brother, and I get you, which is so wonderful." And then she added something which just rocked my world. And she said, "I have holes in my heart and my soul I never even knew existed that have been filled." And I thought about that. I was so touched and so moved by that. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had holes missing within me, or I had holes within me that had been filled as a result of my reunion with my biological family. And so I felt more complete as a person, which was the next best gift, is feeling this level of completeness. I knew finally, because of ancestry, I knew my ethnicity. I'd never really known my ethnicity other than what was in the adoption papers, but who knows what people are putting in those documents back in 1969. And um, then I got to meet. Now I got to know how I came to be, how I was conceived, why I was put up for adoption. All these answers are complete now, and it made me a richer person in my own skin, which was phenomenal. And then I'd say the last gift is equally as powerful. Is I and I mentioned this earlier. Is I have There's more love in my life, and that's so important. I have more people to share my heart and love with. But just if not more importantly, there's more love in my wife's life, in my children's life. And what is wrong with that? That's a beautiful thing, and I'm so forever grateful that someone asked me once, are you glad the heart attack happened to you? And in many ways, I think I am, because it helped me get to this point where I have this reunion that is so wonderful. And this month, or sorry, last oh, it's no it's November now, Juri, but last month, since you and I last talked, I've seen all of them in person, and that's just how we do things. So those would be the just fundamental and powerful gifts that have arrived in my life as a result of all of this.
Well, I truly appreciate you sharing the story on my podcast tonight. And before you leave, if there's somebody out there who's struggling or being adoptee, what's your biggest advice for them?
First of all, you're not alone. You're not alone. There are adoptees who are out there. Secondly, I would, as I said earlier, I would really encourage, if they're able to and they're able to articulate this, make sure you work with an adoption competent therapist. There are a lot of great therapists out there, not to take anything away from any therapist, but I think someone who really understands what happens to an adoptee through separation from their biological kin is really important. And if they have the means and the wherewithal to work with someone who can really help them through it, I think that's important. And they should talk to people, because as we talked about those statistics earlier, 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. Talk to somebody. Just find somebody to talk to if you're in that place. Mental health is so important, and for adoptee mental health, my heart goes out to people who have challenges. And so please find someone to talk to. And if they want to know more, they through my website, they can connect with me, and I can do what I can to help them if that's possible.
Well, again, thank you so much for spending time on a Gift Diversity podcast. And my job really here is to normalize these difficult conversations and really destigmatize the mental health issues, whatever the adversity that people went through. So thank you so much for part of my mission and the movement. And
You're welcome.
I just really hope that this would help a lot of people.
Sounds great, Juri, and it was wonderful to be on the show with you again, and be able a chance to speak with your listeners and with you, of course. And um, it's been a great conversation, a joy for me to have. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, and thank you everyone for joining a Gift Diversity. My name is Juri Love. I'm your host. And again, Adrian Jones, thank you for your conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.